All right, welcome in everyone. My name is PH Irwin, Communications Coordinator here at SAANYS, and I welcome you to another SAANYS Pro Learning session. Today's Summer Specials webinar is titled Understanding the APPR Transition to NYSED Steps Plan. Now, as we begin, please remain muted throughout the webinar, but feel free to use the chat room throughout the session for any questions, and our presenters will get to you. Also, please be aware that this session is being recorded. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Craig Ferretti and Joanne DePue.
Thanks, PH. My name is Craig Ferretti. I am the Deputy Executive Director here at SAANYS. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this morning. And my co-host,
Joanne DePue. I'm the Director of Technology, Data, and Assessment at Springville-Griffith Institute.
All right. So today we're going to go over some beginnings of the STEPS plan and introduce you to some of the key components, as well as from a unit's perspective, things to look out for or to consider when negotiating. We'll take questions if you want to put questions in the chat, and then we can take questions at the end. We do have a wide-ranging audience from many different titles. So this presentation is geared towards units and principals in particular, but obviously we'll talk through with everyone and answer any questions that any of you may have. All right, so let me share our presentation here. Okay, so understanding the transition from APPR, which is the current principal and teacher evaluation plan that we are operating under as districts, to the newly approved STEPS plans. So we're going to look at, like I said, a few components and also talk about some things to consider for bargaining units. And then Joanne's going to discuss her district's experience with the portal and getting approval from state ed. All right, some things to know before beginning the process. Again, with the wide-ranging knowledge, some of you may be involved in this already. Some of you may be hearing this for the first time. But as you know, APPR 3012D, now we are moving, as I said, to STEPS plans, which in the law is 3012E. But what does STEPS stand for? It stands for Standards-Based Educator Evaluation and Professional Support Plan. So acronyms, as we know, that state ed loves acronyms. So that's what a STEPS plan stands for. Timeline for implementation. You can start, some districts already have theirs in place and are working under them. Others, not so much, but you have until 2032, any point from now until then, to get yours in and approved by state ed, but it must be done by 2032. Do you still have to follow our 3012D, our APPR, until we complete a STEPS plan? The answer is yes. You will continue to operate under your APPR, which each year superintendents will go in and portal. Usually there's not any changes at this point, but yes, operate under your APPR until you have a STEPS plan in place, a negotiated STEPS plan. Much like APPR, STEPS plans only affect or only evaluate principals, building principals, and teachers of record. So no other administrative titles, no APs, special ed directors, ADs, etc. Just principals, building principals, as APPR was. And an agreement must be negotiated, and it's required between the unit and the district on the components of STEPS plans. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get going. Okay. All right, some key components of STEPS plans. The goal is professional growth. This is a little bit different from what the focus of APPR was. It seems like it's less of a gotcha like APPR was, and more of professional growth and professional learning for administrators and teachers to help them develop in their profession. So there is a professional learning component of that, which we'll get to as well, but that is the main goal, professional growth. It is based on PCEL standards, the New York version. You can find them on the State Ed website, and we also will send out links to some of the State Ed documents to you after this presentation for you to peruse if you haven't already. But they are based on the PCEL standards, the New York version. These plans will use multiple measures. Can be portfolio, can be projects, surveys, goal setting. It does require observational visits. More than one is a language, which obviously can be two or more. Rating, there's an overall rating as there was with APPR, but it will be based on locally determined expectations. And I'll talk a little bit more, but there seems to be more of an emphasis from State Ed on allowing for local decisions and local determination of a lot of aspects of these STEPS plans as you create it. So the ratings will be on a 1 to 4 scale, which is a little simpler, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Another key component is a principal support plan. So any principal receives either a 1 or 2 as a rating, must have a personalized support plan going into the next school year. This is something of which can be negotiated, or components of the principal support plan can be negotiated between a unit and a district. And again, as I said, emphasis seems to be a lot more on local control under the STEPS plan, which is a nice change from APPR in my opinion. All right. All right, some key differences between APPR and STEPS plan. STEPS plans include observational cycles. Non-tenured, it must be done yearly. So they must have a full observational cycle yearly, including building visits. But tenured administrators can have multiple year, you can create a multiple year observation cycle. It can be 2 years, can be 4 years, can be 6. There's different, they allow you a lot of leeway in deciding how long you'd like your observation cycle to be. There are obviously some things you need to look out for as you go along in there, but it does give you a little bit of freedom. It doesn't necessarily have to be yearly for tenured administrators. And again, that's something that you can decide and negotiate with your district. The choice of rubrics, this is also something that's different, is a fully local decision. It must be aligned with the PCEL standards, but all rubrics for standards and for categories can be chosen by the districts and the units in conjunction. You can use a variety of rubrics as long as they align with the PCEL standards. So there's some local decision there as well. Different from APPR, there's no required use of student achievement data. Again, you can use student achievement data. We'll talk about that in a bit, but you are not required to use any student scores as part of the evaluation of principals in STEPS plans. Also, there's no independent evaluator required. Again, this was a component of APPR, which has gone away for STEPS plans. There's no independent evaluator needed to come in and do any work evaluating principals or teachers. No appeals process is required. We'll talk about this. We do encourage you to try to include one in part of your negotiations with your districts, and we'll talk about why, but you do not necessarily have to have an appeals process in your STEPS plan that you negotiate. In theory, STEPS plans do not affect tenure decisions, and there's no longer the expedited 30/20As as there were under APPR. For STEPS plans, when I say in theory for tenure decisions, it seems logical that if scores and ratings are low for a non-tenured administrator or non-tenured principal, that it would factor into a tenure decision, the results of the STEP plan. But in theory, it's not required. It's not going to be mandated. The middle process for principals and teachers is also a little different. For those of you who have been around, I was a building principal and a unit president at the time APPR was around. And one of the things we had to sit down with the teachers union president at the same time and submit both the teachers' plans and the principals' plans, sign off on them and send them in at the same time. That is a change. Principals and the teachers' plans can be negotiated separately at completely different times. For instance, there's districts that have finished their teachers' plans and may want to wait a year or two to get into the principal's plan. That's totally allowable. They can be submitted to the portal separately. And that is a change from APPR. Big difference, essentially all aspects of the plan are negotiable. So pretty much as you can create your plan, you work with your district and talk about things and make sure that things are right for both sides, but everything is negotiable. And that is a big change. All right. So current APPR agreements with districts. I just wanted to run through this quickly. There are 3 different types. You could have your APPR as part of your collective bargaining unit, meaning it's a part of your contract. We encourage you to do this. If you have this in your contract now, then your steps plan would replace this. So we highly encourage that if possible. Other agreement, a straight MOU where you have a separate MOU or an MOA. It's not referenced in the collective bargaining agreement, but it basically memorializes everything that you've created in your steps plan. We highly encourage at bare minimum to have an MOA with your district that outlines exactly what the components of your step plan. This one happened a lot with APPR, and we're hoping that districts will try to move away from this, and units will try to encourage districts to move away. And that's when parties agreed basically on a portal submission to SED. You agreed with the superintendent on all components of the APPR, and then you submitted it. There was no MOA, and it was not part of your CBA. We again encourage you at the very least to have an MOA, freestanding separate document that basically memorializes the steps plan for you. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of what can be negotiated. And so these are some of the items that I would keep at the forefront when you go through this process with your district. And as I said, essentially everything can be negotiated. The rubrics and the ratings, choice of rubrics, the rating scale, what gets rated. These are all things that can be negotiated. Some measures you choose, multiple measures. Again, this is a decision that you can work with your district and come to some kind of agreement on what will be used. Again, you must have more than one observational visit as part of an observational cycle. That is not negotiable, but all of the measures are. We do encourage you to proceed cautiously with the use of surveys and of student data as part of a measure. Again, those are things, at least in our opinion, that we see that are basically out of the control of the principal to some extent and can end up causing some unduly grief. Observation cycles, again, this is something that you can decide the length of, whether it's, except for non-tenured, that has to be in a yearly thing, but for tenured principals and tenured teachers, it can be multiple year, and that is something that you can work out with your district as part of the negotiations. Of the support plan, as I mentioned earlier, all components of that can be negotiated and created to, again, with the goal of not so much as a gotcha on a principal who is struggling, but more of a professional growth and learning for them to develop their skill sets. Appeals process is something that could be negotiated. We highly encourage that you get an appeals process as part of your steps plan. Again, this is just a safeguard for principals to have this in place. It's fair, in our opinion, to have one in there, and I think it will benefit everybody in the long run. It can be negotiated like a contract is the duration of the agreement. We recommend 2 to 3 years initially, the length of your step plan. Again, longer. If it's time to make changes, it's not going to be as easy. That's why we suggest 2 years, 3 years to start initially to see how it works for you and for the district. Professional learning plan. Professional learning plan is supposed to be tied to and part of a STEPS plan. And this is something, the components of which can be negotiated between you, the unit, and the principals and the district as well. So that's something we encourage you to take time to make sure that it's something that works for both parties. Okay, some recommendations and suggestions. When it's time, and again, some of you may have started the process, some of you may be thinking about it, some of you may be a few years away. But when the time comes, we encourage you to do your homework, be prepared. Go on the state website. Well, again, we'll share some links, but they have a lot of documents up. They have sample agreements. There's a few up there as well. But do the homework, be prepared, kind of know what you're doing when you go in to negotiate with your district and create your plan. Again, if possible, negotiate all decisions. Again, everybody's relationship with their district is different. Some districts work closely with their district office and their superintendent, and it's a collaborative process. Obviously, that would be an easier to create a STEPS plan. Other districts maybe don't have that type of environment in their district, and there'll be more emphasis on negotiating. So again, everyone's different, but do negotiate all your decisions and make sure that you are comfortable with them before moving forward with approving your STEPS plan. Again, as I said, use of surveys and student data. Again, if you're going to use it thoughtfully, carefully, and again, we probably encourage at least initially staying away from it. But again, that's up to each district to decide. Clearly identify lead evaluators. So who is going to be the lead evaluator of the principal? Make sure that is clearly identified and labeled in part of your STEPS plan. Again, as I said, strongly encourage including an appeals process. Mentioned also an MOA would be the best way to memorialize that, at least initially, if you do not have an MOA and you've been using just submittals to the portal. But getting an MOA and then eventually maybe even a contract provision, including it in your contract, is what we recommend. But at minimum, again, creating an MOA between you and the district for your STEPS plan. All right. We'll take any questions on any of that at the end, but I'm going to shift and move to, sorry, one more piece I want to mention. A very important one. We encourage you as administrators, if you have some districts have committees, that APPR committees and whatnot, but be part of your participation in the creation of your teacher's plan. This is something that's important. We'd like we encourage you to be at the table, principals to be at the table when creating the teacher's plan, because again, this is something that you're going to have to live as a supervisor of teachers, and you want to have some say in their STEPS plan as well. So that's something, if your district has not created the STEPS plan yet for your teachers, we highly encourage you or some members of your unit to be part of the creation of that plan. All right, I'm going to turn over to Joanne here. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of their experience with submitting their plan and creating a plan and submitting it. So Joanne.
Thank you. And thank you to SAANYS for putting this presentation together and allowing us to share our journey. So depending on, you want to go back a slide, depending on where you are in this process, I think hopefully there's a little bit for everybody here that I can give you that has been shared along with our journey. We decided to go early on through this process. We started both teacher and principal at the same time. And I'm going to tell you in a couple seconds why we didn't do that. But to get started, we are a rural school. If you want to go to the next slide. We are located just south of Buffalo. We are the home of the Griffins. We have 4 schools, 275 employees, 1,500 students. So we're a relatively small district, but this process is the same whether you're a smaller school, same size school, or you're a large city school. Basically, the process is going to be the same whether you're doing your teacher plan or you're doing your principal plan. So today I just want to share with you basically 3 different sections: how to start the conversation, how we developed our plan and some things that we learned going along the way that hopefully to share with you to make your journey a little bit easier. And then actually how the submission to state ed, how that process worked. So I think most importantly, knowing who your committee, who your representation is, as Craig has said, those elite evaluators, but knowing where you're starting, I think is very helpful. So we actually started last summer and we looked at our plan and our practices, and this is a time for you to change what needs to be changed or keep what you really feel is working. Both our side, the teachers union, and our administrative side and our superintendent, we kind of all got together and had our own lists, things that we liked in our plan, things that we didn't like in our plans. And we developed initial drafts and requests. And we did that before we met together. Our initial meeting, this plan that I'm going to show you is the teacher side of the plan, because once we started submitting, the number of changes and little tweaks was getting to be so difficult. I'm doing it both the teacher side and the principal side, that we decided very early on that we were going to break our two plans in the middle and then start with teachers and then move to principals. If you're going to do that, my word of caution to you is make sure you split the plans early, because once they split them, then you have to start over and they're two separate plans. So don't get too far down the line, or make a copy before you do that so that you don't lose your information. Interestingly enough, if you want to go to the next slide, when we came to the table, our plans were very similar. I'm not sure how that happened, but when we sat the first time down, the teacher's plan really did mimic the administrative side as well. So that started out very early on that we felt our journey was going to be a good process. But there are things on both sides that we wanted to change, and that we agreed very early on that we wanted to keep a majority of our process, and that we just wanted to tweak some of the things. So starting your process, the challenges that we ran into, knowing the groups, who's on your committee, is it well represented? Have they had conversations about the known things that were working well and the things that they wanted to change, and are those clearly articulated? You need to plan time. We started our process in July, and we were not approved until May. So it was almost a year process. One of the other challenges was we did not use the PSAL standards. We used the ISLIC standards. So having to change that over, and as well, introducing the New York teaching standards, as much as they've been around since 2011. It was pretty interesting that most of our teachers were not quite as well aware of the standards that these were moving towards. The state education department has a great amount of resources. So when this presentation goes out, if you look at those links, they do have sample plans that are also posted there. So as Craig said, do your homework and be prepared. State ed has really helped with that and providing some of that information. So a little bit of our timeline. So in the summer, we started meeting with our committees. Part of it is collectively bargained. They got release time and they worked with their representatives and came up, with their agreement. We were lucky enough to be able to only have to come to the table 2 times in order to get those small changes that we were making to our plan solidified. The majority of the work actually came from the committee level to develop new forms and the processes that we were going to take place. So we initially met with our faculty members of our proposed changes, and we decided in November, along with our teachers union, that we were going to move forward, even though that we were in the process, and our backup plan was to go back to our old if we needed to. But we pushed forward, and we really were able to meet the deadlines. You're supposed to have it in by March. Ours was in by March, but it took us until May to finalize all the details. But Stata did allow us to report this year as our first year in our program. I hope that you will find that your experience with Stata was as good as ours was. We had an excellent reviewer and who really did help us walk through the process and gave us some very specific feedback. So there is a lot of upfront work, but I think in the end, that upfront work actually paid off for us in the end. You want to go to the next slide? So some of the key elements of your plan, which, as Craig has said before, that it's all done at the local level. You have a multiple year plan for your tenured teachers. We initially in the portal, it did not allow for more than a 4 or 5 year cycle. I believe we're the first district that pushed past that. And so ours is a 6 year cycle. We also wanted to give our teachers a lot of choice in their cycle. You have to have at least one of the components that you will report on annually, but we do not have to report a final score until the end of year 6. So as you can see, we have 2 required observation years in our particular plan, and then we have 1 secondary measure, and the rest of the years are choice. So whether you're working on your teacher plan or your principal plan, these are all local decisions that you are able to make of how you want to move forward. Other plans have a lot more choices than ours do. We limited ours a little bit, but you have to show to state ed how you're going to meet all of the standards over all of the years was a big part of the component, as well as you have to give your rationale of why you chose which ones are represented in each of the different types of the options that you choose. So for us, as we said, we chose out of the list of secondary measures that teachers could do a learning project. We had done projects here in the past. The significant difference was our observation process went through teaching standards 1 through 4, and then our secondary measures were 5, 6, and 7. So our previous projects didn't have 5, 6, and 7. So you had to have a student learning component, you had to have an assessment component, and you had to have professional growth and collaboration. Some of that was a bit of a challenge to get projects that met all of those standards. So make sure that there's some education about the teaching standards so that they go into that knowing. We also, our teachers union pressed very strongly for a goal setting and reflective as a second choice. And I think along the way, they were pretty much half and half, the teachers who actually chose those measures. But in this, just make sure when you are planning that you look at the choices and you make sure that the choices are manageable, both from your end and from your teacher's end. This was a pretty steep learning curve here to get people up to speed on what was an acceptable project and how it was going to meet all of the components. We particularly use the Danielson rubric. We use the 2022 version. We've been using that for quite some time. We do ours through Frontline. And so we wanted to keep our domains the same. There are lots of options out there for how you can basically unwire Danielson and then rewire it back into the teaching standards. For us, we felt that our process worked well and our teachers really understood how they were evaluated previously. So we tried to keep that as much intact as possible. So as you can see, like all of domain 1 went to standard 2, all of domain 3 went to standard 3, and domain 2 went to standard 4. So that was very important for us. And, if you think about the rubric that you're using on the principal side, And if it isn't already aligned to the P-cell standards, is there a way that you can do it that is familiar to people, that is comfortable for people, or is this a chance for you to change your observation rubric at this time and get something that is working better? I know when we're going to move to our principal side, which we're going to start here in September, we are going to change our rubric, and we are going to use something that we feel is better aligned to our district and moving forward instead of the one that we're doing now. And on the next slide, this is where we had our standards for our projects and our goal setting. We separated standards 1 through 4 for observation, and then 5, 6, and 7 for the projects and goal setting. And again, we tried to keep it as close as possible, but making sure that over the 6-year span that we have addressed all of the standards. This one was not too difficult for us, but again, having an understanding with your unions and with your teachers of how they're going to be evaluated, I think is really good to set out in front before you start to apply at state ed. I think one of the biggest challenges that we had was knowing that we were going to do a 6-year cycle. How do you make groups that can last over a 6-year period? Really looking at your retirements and how things are going to be moving, and how many observations and how many projects and how many goal settings can one individual handle. We tried to group ours, and as you can see, we tried to load balance our numbers between our different buildings. This was a bit challenging, especially knowing that our population is declining and we're moving people around. But I think if you spend some time and kind of look a little bit down the line of where your teachers will fall, or where your administrators will fall, and where will people go once they move from non-tenured to tenured, because they do have to join a group, and then how are they going to get into the next cycle. So spending some time doing some grouping, I think, is helpful, and because you don't really want to overload any one administrator with too many options, and how you can spread the wealth out. I can tell you personally, I had 66 observations last year, and this year I only had 22. So, I mean, it made a huge time difference in the way that we were able to spread ourselves out across our district. So on the non-tenured side, our process stayed exactly the same. But the only thing that we did have to add is you have to have some sort of secondary measure every year so that you do all of the standards. So we kept our observation cycle the same that we had. And then we just added a goal setting piece for which did teaching standards 5, 6, and 7. It wasn't as rigorous as the one that we had for tenured teachers, really trying to get teachers to develop a goal that that was actionable for them, to get them ready for when they become tenured, that they will be able to have a more lofty goal or a larger project when they get on that tenured side. So, but this was an addition to the non-tenured side. So they actually had more to do, and we did as well as administrators too. So that's just something to be noteful of, that you do have to add a secondary measure for your non-tenured teachers. And then the last section is a submission to the state ed portal. You actually have to request that you open the portal, and then once you do that, you are assigned a reviewer. You should decide really early on if you're going to just do teacher only, principal only, or if you're going to try and tackle them both at the same time, because they actually have to open you up the plans that you need to submit. And then also when they open the plans, once you decide what your groups are, more sections of the plan open up. So if you just download the plan itself, there are pieces that you don't see until you actually start submitting, and then more boxes open up. So all of you that are familiar with the portal, you know how that happens. You click a box and then all of a sudden you have 2 more pages to do. The same thing happens here too. So just a word of caution on that. As you can see, our timeline from October to February was quite a long time. So we spent time with our reviewer going through each section, and we kept a conversation ongoing through email in online meetings, and we fixed all of the problems and all of the potential issues before we actually hit the submit button. There are plans that are done. I encourage you to go look at the language. It is a lot of wordsmithing. It needs to be very clear for anyone to read it. They kind of have a 3-step process. It starts with your initial reviewer, and then you move on to their supervisor, and then you move on to the assistant commissioner, and then you get it. Once it's submitted, then you start unsubmitting and resubmitting. As much as you can take care of before that initial submission will really cut down on that last piece. On the next slide. Some of the key challenges that we found while we were submitting. Initially, when we started, the culturally responsive and sustaining educational framework question was not in the portal at that time. They added that in the middle of our process. So if you have some time to look at that and look at some of the responses, you have to show how your process actually meets each of those sections in a narrative part. The second challenging part was how your plan actually meets each of the teaching standards. So when you chose an observation and you chose which domains, how did those domains match that particular standard? And again, that is in like a verbal response in paragraph form. We had a lot of back and forth on how to make sure that they understood our rationale of our process and how it would meet those standards. That's going to be the same thing if you're going to, how is your observation and how are your projects or secondary measures going to meet the PSEL standards as well. So that also was a pain point to try and make an understanding for that. And probably the most difficult, which should probably be the most easy, which is just a basic math problem, is to determine your ratings. I think we probably had 10 different emails just to understand the process of how to come to a final rating. But again, the links are here on the challenges. For the state ed now has many more resources and sample plans that you can actually look at and see how it is that they were submitted. So on the next slide here, this rating piece, very difficult. And in the end, the bottom line is probably the most important. At the end, you have to come up with a whole number. When you go to submit your numbers into the state ed portal for teacher observation, they can only be a whole number. So however you determine your number of observations, the rounding rule piece is really important. And when you round and where you round, at the end of each year, when you have to report on one of your standards, it has to be a whole number. So as you can see, you can give whatever points you want during the year, but then initially it has to come down to a whole number. And then once you get the whole number, if you go to the next page, your overall rating also has to be a whole number. You have to provide a scale for which, the rounding applies to, but in the end, everything has to get to a whole number. And I think if I would have known that ahead of time, that would have made it much easier to determine a formula to make that happen. So like I said, it should have been an easy mathematical problem, but in the end, it really wasn't. But the reviewer was particularly helpful. This stage got caught up at the associate commissioners. That is where that finally got recognized. So we came to the end of a year. We pushed through it. Everybody was able to complete all of theirs. We do have some glitches. We do have a few things that we're going to change. We have our committee, which has now been renamed to our STEPS committee. We have kind of collected those little pain points over the year. I don't believe that there's anything that will need to be renegotiated, but in the steps and the forms that we have, we found a few glitches. Another thing that we need to look for is how are we going to prepare new hires to come into this process and the explanation of, how this is going to work for them. And then to figure out how to roll up the cycle. We have a quite of a large Google Doc that we keep all of our information in, and trying to figure out how we're going to keep all of those scores for 6 years. We do work in frontline, as I said before, and so our forms are set up to calculate for 6 years. I am not sure that that's going to work at this point because it's so many different numbers over the time. So we are going to keep a separate document so that we can double check, and also for us to keep a record of the annual submission of what scores that we are going to apply in the portal at the end of the summer. And I do see that in the portal that it is available that you can choose whether you're doing your APPR or steps. So that I think maybe the next one that we do is how you actually complete this and how you can submit all of your ratings. So I hope that you found the information that I gave you is helpful. If you have any questions, you can please feel free. My contact information is here. I don't feel that it was an arduous process for us. I think, going back to starting at the beginning, what is your committee? What is your representation? What are your goals at the end of this process? Will really help you to get through. And hopefully you'll have a good journey as we did.
All right. Thank you, Joanne. One thing I neglected to mention that SAANYS is working on a fillable rubric. It's based on the P-cell standards. It's in final stages of production. It's something that we'll share out with units. It's something for you to consider going along and creating a rubric of your own. So something that we'll share in the not too distant future. So do we have any questions?